The United States has sanctioned 24 Chinese and Hong Kong officials over Beijing's crackdown in the city. The move comes ahead of U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken's meeting with top Chinese diplomats in Alaska. In a statement, Blinken said the move was in response to restrictions imposed by China, which would undermine Hong Kong's electoral system. These sanctions have been imposed under the Hong Kong Autonomy Act, which was passed last year by the administration led by former President Donald Trump. This act came in response to the imposition of the national security law in Hong Kong. The sanctions include Wang Chen, who is one of China's top decision-making bodies, the Politburo, and Tam Yeo Chung, who is the only Hong Konger on the committee which drafted the national security law. The sanctioned officials and their family members have been barred from traveling to the United States. They will also face financial curbs, including restrictions on banking, loans from U.S. financial institutions, buying property, or dealing with U.S. entities. The United States sanctioning 24 Chinese and Hong Kong officials over Beijing's crackdown on the city. The national security law brought in by Beijing has had far-reaching implications for Hong Kong as well as the pro-democracy movement there. Richard Kimber is joining us from Hong Kong for more on these developments. Hi, Richard. Give us a better sense of the impact of these sanctions on the Hong Kong officials.
Well, this is very much an extension of what had been put in place by the Trump administration. Secretary of State Antony Blinken listing 24 more Hong Kong and Chinese officials that will be targeted by US sanctions, effectively blocking any business that can be done between them and foreign banks. Now, in the past, these types of sanctions have had very limited effect in terms of changing any political strategy from both Beijing and the Hong Kong governments. And the early reaction here suggests that the same will be true, that really it won't change the course at all of what Beijing has put in place. Even as these sanctions have been introduced, the Chief Executive, Carrie Lam, here has been outlining a new framework here in Hong Kong to try to push through these new reforms from Beijing as quickly as possible so that they can take place in Hong Kong's political system before the end of the current term. So even while these sanctions are being introduced, the exact reforms that they're criticising are being pushed through at great speed here in Hong Kong.
When it comes to the reforms to the electoral system in Hong Kong, we've seen the Hong Kong Chief Executive Carrie Lam not once but on multiple occasions spell out her stance, and that has been in support of these reforms. What has been the reaction on the ground? Do we see protests, if at all, in response to this move?
It's so difficult now for there to be any kind of protest because the national security law largely outlaws any form of large gathering that has an anti-government or subversive intention. So it's very unlikely that we'll ever see again the types of protests that were commonplace in 2019. Instead, there's been a huge amount of lobbying taking place from those democracy activists who are still speaking out towards international governments like, of course, the US that's come out with these sanctions, and also to the UK and the European Union. And just in the last few days, another prominent activist from Hong Kong has left the city and has gone to Australia, where he says he plans to try and lobby harder there because he says there's a lack of representation from Hong Kong democracy activism down under. So there's efforts being made internationally to try to increase the pressure on Beijing and Hong Kong. Here locally, there's very little opportunity to do that because so many of the high-profile activists have either been arrested or are now facing court trials to pursue the various offences that they've been deemed to have undertaken under this national security law. So on the ground here, little sign of the type of activism that we became used to a couple of years ago.
Leaving it there for the moment, Richard Kimber, thanks very much for all of those updates. WION now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.